Every few years, someone rediscovers a one-sided conversation caused by someone making up stuff. 1942, a Manhattan Project code name was made up for some Army elements involved in it, and that was the Manhattan Engineer District. Manhattan Project, the engineering part of it. Army Corps engineers. None of this was ever called the Manhattan-Rochester Coalition or the Manhattan Engineering District 44. Those are words that were made up. They don't exist except as a kind of copyright trap or whatever for someone's work. 1953 to 1963, 10-year duration, a fluorescent powder was released into many cities to do an experiment. In St. Louis, the city environment was tested using an aerosol test type design using this fluorescent powder. It's an inorganic compound composed of non-radioactive isotopes, as in normal materials named zinc, cadmium, sulfur. Zinc cadmium sulfide glows bright yellow or green when you expose it to black light, ultraviolet light. It could easily be detected and was used as a tracer in various environments. At the time, it was thought to be completely non-toxic. That's not necessarily changed since then, even though it's a lot of years at the time of the test. But the zinc cadmium sulfide dispersion tests maximum exposure to cadmium, which is the one that's most of, sulfur and zinc are all over the place, so it's really just the cadmium. The cadmium intake was, at the time, below, and this is confirmed, below the equivalent to inhaling 11 weeks of normal urban air, bad quality air with cadmium in the air, based on normal levels found in St. Louis at 24 micrograms per cubic liter or whatever in air versus 1 microgram in Fort Wayne and 7 micrograms in Minneapolis. They were basing this on Minneapolis or Fort Wayne. So St. Louis was already a dirty enough air quality environment that exposure to this amount of cadmium that was compounded. It was part of a compound, which means you would have to have some coercive force to break it up. And by the way, that's what made zinc and sulfur glow, is the cadmium in it. The compound itself would create this reaction to ultraviolet light. Instead of the ultraviolet light breaking down this compound, it would release light in the normal visible spectrum, yellow and green. That's how that works. I'm not going to explain it anymore unless anybody wants me to do a separate video. The fluorescent powder was manufactured by a company called New Jersey Zinc Company. They would add cadmium and sulfur to the material. Later, it was also made by another New Jersey company, and they also made unrelated items for the medical industry and physical research spectrum, as well as watch dials. They made radium-based paint for watch dials. This was the U.S. Radium Corporation. Now, the thing is, glow-in-the-dark materials that didn't react to ultraviolet light, that would just glow, wasn't what the military wanted to use. If you had given them that, that would be considered a contaminant, and they wouldn't accept it. Deciding that the military would somehow moo-ha-ha need to expose people to radium in 1953 to 1963 for a project, because their whole thing is this U.S. Radium Corporation thing. The whole thing was to depopulate the planet or kill people or whatever. That's a bit of a stretch, and you have to have a basis for it. Meanwhile, exposure to radium has very definite health effects that are not matching what people went through in St. Louis necessarily. Also, people in New Jersey downwind of the radium plant had effects you can check against. And I'm going to repeat something that should be obvious. Zinc cadmium sulfide is not, it doesn't have to be made from the radioactive versions of the elements, and isn't. Tiny amounts of radioactive material is all around you, including uranium in the dirt everywhere. And it's especially concentrated at beaches and along stream beds and former stream beds, because it collects a lot like gold does. Zinc cadmium sulfide is and was not a biological weapon. or hazard. It's still not considered medically significant or dangerous, at least at the time I did the video last time, and also as of today I tried to look it up. And it's not a radioactive weapon because the elements themselves have to be radioactive. Of the elements that are insinuated as inherently radioactive, because for some reason zinc can't be non-radioactive, we find, if we look up the isotopes, there are 20 different sulfurs that could be considered radioactive. The half-life for one of them is a maximum is 87 days. For cadmiums, we have one that's 462 days, so a little over a year, and another one under a year at 244 days for zinc. And that particular one is actually has a trace of reality to it. That one was used as a tracer in studies, as a radioactive only tracer, not an ultraviolet one. And that was done in a completely unrelated project. Not for dispersion in cities to moo-ha-ha, let's give everybody cancer because reasons. Now I want to point out at the same time, the United States was dropping nuclear warheads on its own country. And it got as far as, guess where? Rochester, New York, and St. Louis. Radiation exposure from actual fucking atom bombs going off in the United States happened during this time and affected things like film. This is something we have documented. But no, it has to be something that was dropped on the ground, deliberately made to not be radioactive because someone made an assertion that it had to be radioactive because they did that for a scenario. I'll explain that next. But let's look into half-lives. If you have 10 half-lives, let's say everything here is a year. Let's just round it off to like a year. That means after 10 years, it divides 10 times by half. That's a half-life. So that's 1,024 to 1 reduction in its danger level or threat after 10 years. After 48 years, it's 281 trillion to 1 in 2011. In 2023, it's 1,152 quadrillion to 1 reduction in danger. And no, I don't want to hear homeopathic division. Please don't do that. Now we're going to bring up the person who brought up the idea that this had to be a radioactive substance, insinuated it strongly or overtly said it, and then walked it back over the years, and is the only source for the name Manhattan Rochester Coalition and Manhattan Engineering District 44. If you look those up, it leads just to this person. The person we're talking about is Lisa Martino Taylor. Her works and workplace and education listing that I could look up. This is combining things, and it's chronological. 1998, she worked at a law firm doing class action lawsuits, write-ups, till 2010, and one of them involved St. Louis and people trying to convince everybody that they'd been hit with radioactive material. And if it wasn't radioactive, it had to be a biological weapon. And if it wasn't a biological weapon, it's an unknown possible kind of maybe could hurt us. And again, as of today, I can't find a listing that says definitively what this shit does to anybody. Meanwhile, this was during, again, the period of time when radioactive fallout was landing in St. Louis, New York, everywhere. Everybody was downwind of radiation. 1995, Lisa Martino Taylor did a BS in psychology and then a master's degree in sociology by 2006. It's a long period of time. Kudos to her to finish all that. And in that year, she was listed as a University of Missouri Columbia PhD sociology graduate. She got a PhD in 2006. While working as also a sociology instructor at the University of Missouri Columbia till 2010. So 2010, 2011, she was working at a law firm, getting her degree, teaching, kicking ass, taking names academically. She did a paper or work in 2008 called the Military-Industrial Academic Complex, comparing the military-industrial complex that people already know about, and then saying the academia was part of it, which it was in some ways. And a new social autism, which I think would not fly very well on Twitter these days if she added that in. That's part of the title. By 2011, the sociologist philosophy student had to do a dissertation. She asserted that evidence indicates a Manhattan-Rochester coalition did something 1945 to 1970 to a vulnerable St. Louis population without their consent, and radioactive material may have been involved. And again, if you're not aware of it, even though it's hard to test for this stuff after this many years, at 11 quadrillion to 1, in 1973, at 10 years, it was 1,024 to 1. And by 2011, when she did this subject matter, or was discussing it, or being involved in a court case, at 281 trillion to 1, it was still detectable and was not found in any samples that people took. People found day glow stuff on the ground and found it and picked it up and put it in little bottles once in a while. There are samples from that era. Now, this assertion or whatever was a philosophical dissertation as a sociologist and was fictitious. This was based on her doing all this work for the law firm, yes, but it was fictitious. 2012 to 2014, she was on a sabbatical or still working as a sociology instructor at one of the colleges. 2014, associate psychology professor in St. Louis. This is all it says till 2018. It doesn't say what college. 2017, wrote and sold a book, Behind the Fog, based on all of the above, and also had 3 other works prominently posted that were different. 2018, assistant sociology professor, Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, till now. The last posting she made on social media was on Twitter, October of 2019. 2022, she had 6 works on ResearchGate. 3 were just redone versions of the precursors or that same book about, the fog book, I'm going to call it. 2023, a year later, it now lists 19 works, but most of those are derivative. They're talking about the other work she did. She's like scrambling stuff together to get it going on. Today we see her as the only citation when someone's claiming that the Army said they added fluorescent substances to zinc cadmium sulfide, even though that compound is the fluorescent substance, and also saying whether it was radioactive remains a secret when it's not. It never was. That is a lie. Period. This is just like most of the other above. Very loosely fictionalized military-sponsored abuse of civilians using a possibly hazardous radioactive stimulant or simulant. She kept misspelling it. She dramatized this hypothetical secret post-Manhattan project by her own admission. And this is why she now says her specialties include radiological, chemical, and biological weapons testing on the U.S. population, state crimes, social community effects of hazardous waste, organizations and work, elite deviance, corporate crime, social control. This is after only previously listing public and applied sociology, qualitative research methods, employment relations, social movements, and political and economic institutions studies. Originally, she never made any of these claims academically after this because this was originally a philosophical degree of a hypothetical situation and what the philosophical repercussions would be if this was real. This is a fictionalized account she came up with because she worked at a law firm helping people try to sue the federal government, which is like pissing uphill, to get any help about radiation from the frickin' fallout from nuclear bombs going off. It had nothing to do with this test. But because they had it there, they decided to imply that it had to be radioactive because one of the companies involved in making this stuff also made radium. But radium wasn't detected, has completely different half-life timings, and you can easily detect it. It wasn't detected. So they changed the story to say it had to be a radioactive zinc because, or phosphorus or cadmium. Well, the radioactive zinc did exist, but they didn't make it, and they had nothing to do with it, and it wasn't used near the area, so that fell apart. So after a while, they just said it was zinc cadmium sulfide might be dangerous. Whether people settled out of court or not doesn't matter. Whether or not she lied or simply just kept letting people believe things doesn't matter. The Manhattan Project never had a component named Manhattan Engineering District 44 or Manhattan Rochester Coalition. That's a lie. Those are confirmably associated with her. Next, Manhattan Rochester Coalition did exist as a coalition of Manhattan and Rochester areas doing public good for the population to help the community. I don't know why she would mutate literally a bunch of people going around trying to collect clothing for the poor, but that's literally the only reference that ever existed. And it's a single line in an article in a newspaper, and I can't even find it anymore. Nothing Lisa Martino Taylor said about the subject was ever supposed to be taken seriously, other than a hypothetical scenario to get her philosophical degree or paper done or dissertation done. And afterwards, when she wrote that book, I'm going to claim that it was completely fictitious. Thanks for watching. Have a good day. Good luck with it.